what the Buddha is saying is that the suffering is, on this level, suffering is the other word, it's very imprecise, is more fundamental than pleasure. The pleasure tends to be a reduction in the intensity of suffering. So for instance, you're really hot and really bothered, and you come into a cool place and you feel really pleasurable because you've reduced the amount of suffering. And many experiences of everyday pleasure are merely that. Or when you get something that you really, really want, it's questionable how much of the pleasure is in the consumption or the experience of that particular object, and how much it is just taking away all the stress and the tension and the desire of wanting to get it, and afraid that you're not going to get it. And the fact that this kind of pleasure doesn't tend to last very long because it's conditioned by all kinds of things that you can't control. For instance, your own physical body, and you can only physiologically, you can only sustain a certain level of happiness for pleasure, physical pleasure, for a certain length of time. Then you get hungry, you're tired, you need to go to the toilet or whatever. Now, another part of this is that this kind of pleasure often leads to more suffering in the future when you start to derive less and less pleasure from the same stimulation. So you see this with drugs. You take one pill and you get a certain kind of high, and then after a while you need to take two to get the same kind of high, and you have to take three, and then you're on the path of addiction because you have to increase the stimulation. So this is the law of diminishing returns. So this is the whole sort of play of pleasure and pain in everyday life. Okay, but in Buddhism, when we're talking about like happiness and suffering, we're not always talking about that level of pain and pleasure. And it's important to recognize or understand that Buddhism is not teaching like an emotionless kind of state where you just don't feel anything. That's like a goal to aspire to. But what we can observe is that certain emotions are stimulated and fed by ignorance and craving, and certain emotions are not. And so through the path of meditation and practice, as you reduce the power of these negative thoughts and cravings, then the emotions associated with them become less. But those emotions which are not created or fed by negative emotions or ignorance actually become stronger. So one of the key things to observe is how intimately connected wisdom and compassion are. And the Buddha, when he was enlightened, became someone who was his Buddhahood was most clearly defined in terms of his wisdom and his compassion. So those are the two sort of main powers or virtues of the Buddha. So these kind of positive emotions of kindness and compassion, empathy, all these become released and become much more powerful to the extent that you can let go of the negative emotions. But it's an emotional development. It's an abandonment of negative emotion and development of positive emotion. But even with the positive emotion, if you identify with the emotion, say that's who I really am, then you're liable to suffer through that force of identification. So there's pain and pleasure alternating in daily life, something to study and understand the whole dynamic of. And then there's a much larger question of what is happiness, what is suffering, and there are very many different and increasingly subtle levels of this. And I think one analogy and comparison is of health. If we say someone, I'm in really good health, and then someone was to ask you, well, what does that mean? what do you mean, in really good health? It's very hard to answer that question in a positive idiom. You have to usually say, well, I don't have any aches and pains, or I don't have this, or I don't have that. So, and then somebody said, well, that sounds a pretty kind of negative thing, you know, just all the things you don't have. But I mean, what's health really like? But it's so difficult to express that verbally. And the kind of happiness that develops through Dhamma practice is like that. You know, it's hard to really say, you know, it's not like a high in that kind of, you know, there's kind of high you can get from some kind of stimulation. But it's that sense of health, like mental health, you know, where you don't have this depression or anxieties and worries and agitation and all those unhealthy mental traits are no longer present, or only very fleetingly present. Anything? Anybody over here? One question? So I'm going to ask these are in Thai. English one. The Thai ones this afternoon. Yeah.
Yesterday you mentioned if sometimes if you seek pleasure on taking sleeping pills or drugs or etc. and then it's not good for you, of course not good for you, but sometimes I have some friends who have not mental problems, but they're into meditation since they were young as well, but lately he or she has been feeling like for the past 3-4 years, the personality are changing. So, like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or anxiety disorder, and becoming decisions or anything in his life is not as it was before. Before it was very outgoing, and now that he became introvert, and before that he was he can make swift decisions, and the business is doing well, and after a while, he hardly takes an order for anything.
Sure.
So I recommend it to him, because this is good friend, and he went to the temple every day, work, and he went to the doctor now, and the doctor diagnosed him with anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, and now he's getting some medication which he feels, which he said that it's helping him with. Is that wrong?
No, not at all. I quite sympathize. I think it's very important to stress that, like, meditation is not some kind of magic bullet, or it's not a panacea. I mean, it's not like you can cure every kind of mental problem through some meditation technique. Particularly if you take that technique out of the context of the whole of the Buddha's teachings, or the whole, what they call the whole educational process. And this is what often happens, particularly as I've seen in the West, where people take Buddhist meditation techniques, but completely out of the whole context of the Buddha's training of sila, and samadhi, and panya. But to begin with, prevention is better than cure, but in the case that someone has quite a chronic illness like this, then drugs, can play an important part, at least short term, just to give somebody the ability just to rest and to sort of make a fresh start. So I think that in some cases there needs to be both things, and placebo effect is of course very powerful, and in the antidepressant medications, what do they call can't remember all the names of the antidepressant medicines, but anyway, if you give somebody a pill and just tell them it's an antidepressant, and then gives them a real antidepressant, there's hardly any difference in the results that you'll get. So when somebody believes that they're taking an antidepressant, then they'll get the same results as actually taking one. So we do have these inner resources if we know how to make use of them. Yesterday, the point I was trying to make was that just generally, the moment, if it's not a sort of a serious illness, one in which you need to see a psychiatrist or a therapist, but one which you're just leading a pretty scattered and unbalanced, crazy kind of lifestyle, and you just want some kind of medication to be able to keep up that crazy lifestyle, instead of saying, maybe I need to change the way I'm living my life, then that's what I was criticizing. But I fully recognize that there are some drugs are necessary and useful for mental suffering. Atlantida war civilization. I'm afraid I don't understand the question. The Atlantida war civilization, something 72 or 73, it was clean, parenthesis, complete civilization, now civilization in 84 mixed combined. Devil stealthily, yeah, I don't, maybe if you could rephrase that in Thai, or I don't really know what the question means. Something about God and the devil anyway. Does anybody want to ask, or if you're embarrassed, maybe just to rephrase the question? Okay. Please explain the difference between sin in Christianity and bhap in Buddhism. Yeah, this very significant difference. Many years ago now, there was a request from Buddhist community in Thailand to the Catholic community, please don't use Buddhist technical terms to translate Christian terms because it's confusing. But they didn't agree, and so often sin in Christianity, in the Thai Bible, I think, is translated as bhap. But it's important to recognize there's very significant differences between the two concepts. So in Christianity, you have the idea of a God who lays down rules. Humanity should learn these rules and keep them. And if you're disobedient, then God will punish you. And if you're obedient, God will reward you. So it's a reward and punishment system. You need to know what God wants you to do and try to do it. In Buddhism, we do not believe in a creator God. We don't believe in someone who's laid down rules for human beings and rewards them when they do good things and punishes them when they do bad things. The Buddha's starting point for the Dhamma, or the Buddha Dhamma, is human nature, and what we can observe about human nature, and what we can do, what we can, the wisest way to deal with our human nature. And the Buddha said, pointed out that if we act or speak or think about things, when our mind is affected or influenced by defilement, by greed, by hatred, by delusion, then our mind becomes more greedy, more hateful, more deluded. So every time you act with greed, you increase the amount of greed in your mind. Every time you act with anger, you increase the amount of anger in your mind. Every time you act, you think, you dwell upon something with jealousy, you increase the power of jealousy in your mind. Those negative qualities we can call bad karma, and they are going to increase suffering in your life, in present and in future. So whenever we act with greed, hatred and delusion, then that's bāp. So the definition of bāp is dependent upon the particular mental phenomena present in the mind, moment by moment. It's not a matter of obeying or disobeying rules that are found in a book somewhere or in a holy book. It's a matter of the psychological factors, emotions present in the mind and identified with moment by moment. So I think it's very clear there's a significant difference there. The second question is the difference between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana. Well, this is kind of a huge topic, and one which you could write PhD thesis or thick books about. So I'll make just a few very simple comments or generalizations. After the Buddha passed away, Buddhist communities, monastic communities, spread throughout India. In those days, of course, communications were poor, and so the particular slant or interpretation of the teachings, or those areas of the teachings which were emphasized, would depend a lot on the monks in that particular group, and in particular on the personality of and wisdom of the teacher. So inevitably, there were certain differences that arose, and the Buddhists also were living in a probably the most sophisticated culture in the history of the world. I mean, religiously, there's never before or after, even to the present day, a society so sophisticated in religious and spiritual matters as the India of 2,500 years ago. And so Buddhists were constantly being asked, well, Buddha teaches this, how does that differ from what my religion teaches? Or this kind of question about sin and bāp and all these kinds of things. And so there was pressure on the monks to systematize the teachings of the Buddha. And this is the background, what we call the Abhidhamma, the effort to put all the Buddha's teachings into a system. And so various of these different groups of monastic groups, can't really call them sects, but probably could, that's the word that's usually used, developed their own systematization, or their own Abhidhamma. So what we have was usually called the Tripitaka. We have the suttas, which are the discourses of the Buddha, the Vinaya, which are all the rules governing the life of the monks, and then we have Abhidhamma. But there's not just one Abhidhamma, there are lots of Abhidhammas according to the different sects and their scholars systematizing the teachings. So we have a Theravada Abhidhamma, and there were various other Abhidhammas. So this was a cause for some divergence. And after a while, you could see that the groups of monks developed into two main kind of groups, which we could very simply refer to as the conservatives and the liberals. Okay, so the conservative groups all had the basic idea that the teachings that the historical Buddha laid down are complete, and there's everything there that human beings need to study and practice and realize enlightenment. And it is the job of monks and those Buddhists to transmit those teachings, to look after them, to keep studying and practicing them, and to share them with anyone who might be interested. So that's the conservative group. And there were many of these sects, and all of them gradually disappeared. And the one that survived was called Theravada, what we can now call Theravada. It spread to the south of India and then moved over to Sri Lanka, where it flourished. Now the other sects, it was called liberal, had many new ideas about the Buddha, who the Buddha was, what enlightenment is, and they were also much more willing to adapt to surrounding value systems and religions. Their idea was that you maintain the essence, but you should be willing to be more flexible with cultural, external or superficial elements of the teachings in order to spread the teachings as widely as you can. So this was a much more kind of missionary, expansive kind of Buddhism, which spread throughout India and also northwards into China, and eventually from China to Tibet and Korea, Japan, all those countries in northern Asia. So this Mahayana Theravada division is sometimes called Northern Buddhism and Southern Buddhism, although for a long time it was Mahayana and Hinayana, but Hinayana was considered to be quite an insulting term, so it was agreed quite recently to use Theravada in preference to that. Just as a digression here, monks of the Theravada school, it seems, spread also in various places, and one group ended up in Egypt and may well have formed the role model for the Christian monastic system that grew up in the desert of Egypt and Middle East. But also the word Thera is believed to be the root for the modern word therapy, therapeutic, so something that cures and heals the human mind. There is belief that it comes from the word Thera, and it originates with this group of monks living in Egypt, but there's a kind of a paper on this, whether or not it's correct or not. It's an interesting point. Mahayana Buddhism, with its very liberal kind of stance, absorbed elements of the cultures and religions that it met as it expanded. Where it went to Tibet, for instance, Tibet had a very powerful animist culture called Boon. And so the Tibetan Buddhism absorbed a lot of like animist and magical practices. Went to China, of course it met Confucianism, Taoism, and absorbed them into itself. Went to Japan and absorbed Japanese cultural elements and religious elements. Again, it's in the Mahayana school itself, and eventually you have Tantrayana, then there are different kinds of philosophies and teachings. One reason is that they started to write their own suttas, which were ascribed to the Buddha. So instead of saying this is, the teaching of our wise monks or our teacher, they said this is the Buddha said this and the Buddha said that. So they were criticized for this. They said, how can you put these words into the Buddha's mouth? So the answer to this was that at the time of the Buddha, people weren't very intelligent, and the really highest teachings were just too hard for people of that time to understand. So the Buddha gave them to the devas, to the Tevada, and said, look after these teachings until some really smart people are born. And then you can transmit Thai thought to these smart monks, as opposed to the dumb monks in the Buddha's time. And so they said, this is what happened. So we got these teachings from the devas, but the devas got them from the Buddha. And that's why they're every bit as authentic as the Pali Sutta. So you have all these suttas that were various schools of Mahayana Buddhism created, and that they consider to be as authentic as, or as weighty as Theravada. So, trying to simplify here, the idea of a Buddha is different in Mahayana, particularly in Tantrayana. And in Mahayana, this idea of you practice in order to become a Buddha, and that anybody can be a Buddha, and that an Arahant is not the end of the practice. There's something beyond Arahantship, which the Mahayana school aspire to. But probably the most well-known of the Mahayana doctrines is that of the Bodhisattva, and the idea that you renounce your own enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. This is a very noble aspiration, and one which is characteristic of Mahayana. But although there are significant philosophical differences, it's important to recognize that there's never been any religious wars between Mahayana and Theravada. There's never been any open conflict. At most, maybe the Theravadas think we're right and they're wrong, and they think that they're right and Theravadins are wrong. But there are some important underlying similarities and points of communion. And one is that the Four Noble Truths is basically accepted by all forms of Buddhism. They say there is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, there is an end of suffering, and there is a path to the end of suffering. So so the first two of those Noble Truths are explained almost identically. The difference is in the understanding of the third Noble Truth, what is the complete release from suffering, and most obviously in the fourth Noble Truth, the path or the particular practices that lead to freedom from suffering. But the overall framework of the Four Noble Truths is common to both Theravada and Mahayana. Well, we've run over time a little bit, so I think we'll leave the morning session at this point. And please try to be mindful and aware and composed during the midday. Try to refrain from the speaking addiction as much as you can. It's a good training, and we'll carry on this afternoon.